Okay, thanks, Mark. I'm pretty conscious that it's not so much being between you and your lunch or your afternoon tea, but between you and your conversation, which is even worse, as I've discovered last night. So I just wanted to tackle this sacred cow, really, I think, just for a short while. And I probably need to say as I start two things actually on this slide. One is I'm conscious that there's many different detailed understandings of what mainstreaming means. I mean, here I am very much talking about what I'll show you on the next page, but we could end up having a bit of a discussion about the term. The other thing I just highlight is this study that I'm just going to report briefly on is actually very much a co-production, co-design and production one actually, with one of our bureaucrats in what was then our climate change department, who were wanting to explore this. So actually it was quite a good thing. This was a policymaker who actually took time out and joined in on the project, not to do the actual interviews I'll mention, but in all the design and interpretation. So I think you can look in plenty of places. I'm sure you can find quotes like this that basically says our most urgent thing to do with adaptation is to mainstream it all, and you get it in various different forms. And I won't go through these, but those are all examples of essentially that statement. But the question, so perhaps just focus your attention on the very last one, this Dovers and Hesry paper in Wires, which commented that having done the mainstreaming, it may not be enough in the long run, but at least it would be an accelerated start. Now that's probably true, but it does sort of raise the question then, could we be trying to do mainstreaming prematurely? And I think there's a parallel here. Let's take another sacred cow, which is sustainable development. I think if you think about it, it's been sort of notionally mainstream since the 1980s, and it has triggered some really important and useful incremental change, getting into boardrooms and things like that. But in the end, no one can really look back over the last couple of decades and say that we've successfully addressed some of the transformative needs of sustainable development in terms of consumption and equity and various other things which are all broadly going in the wrong direction still. And in fact, in Australia here, we had, in talking about what we called ESD, I've forgotten what it stood for now, Environmental Sustainable Development was the term that was used in Australia. And there was a report in 1999 that suggested that, in actual fact, that also hadn't been particularly successful. So we should learn from this. I think the effort in this was to stick it in the, usually in the environment departments of governments, and then embed it in various ways. But as a result, a whole lot of the more transformative aspects never really got dealt with. So, I mean, someone was saying yesterday that there's an awful lot of organisational change and so on, literature's out there, and indeed you can go back to those and ask, well, what are the things that successfully embed innovations into organisations or organisations at any scale? And when you look through them, actually a bit of a message, actually looking through them, in one of the other collaborator on this is someone who works in this area as an organisational psychologist sort of person, and actually, it's quite challenging. You go through that literature and there are huge lists, laundry lists of success factors and failure factors, but actually I would say a very poor synthesis of when things work and when they don't, so that you could actually predictively go into a situation and say, in this particular context, we should worry about this success factor, whereas it's this one in another one. But nonetheless, one thing that does come out of all of that literature is that there's probably all three of these things that affect whether things are successful. So this is an important thing, because I think in climate adaptation we tend to think about the technical aspects of the climate challenge, and that's going to be the problem or not, or we think about the adaptive capacity specifically. But the suggestion here is that actually we always have to think about an integrated package of these things. And you can easily think about these, so characteristics of challenges. Oh, no, actually, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So just to express this, you've got the organisation with all of its goals and normal operating procedures and possible specialist functions. You've got its operating environment, obviously its sort of legal context, institutional context, and then you've got these challenges coming in, and which of course are from all sides of all sorts of different things, but here particularly from the climate side. I want to just draw one other idea in here too, which is the issue of structural arrangements. So these are just intended to be simplified diagrams of how you could arrange the responsibility for dealing with climate change in an entity. So if you can imagine that entity on the left there has got a bit of a executive function, the box on top, and then it's got a series of departments. So it could be a government, it could be a large business, it could be all sorts of things. So you could just say every department has to take charge of its own thing. That's essentially what we do with, say, things like gender equality. I don't know actually how you do it here, but that's in Australia at least. Every department is supposed to report on that. You could have the second one where there's a few departments that have got particular interest in this, so maybe in terms of environmental issues, agriculture, environment, and a couple of others, and just say they have to. Or you could have a specialist function, the one on the right. And then you can think of other sort of hybrid things. You could have a specialist function, but then trying to oversee all of the things. And that specialist function could be one of the departments, which is what we had with our Department of Climate Change until recently when it was disbanded. Or you could have it specifically in the executive function. And I'm going to come back to this as an important issue. And in fact, if you look at things like this World Resource Institute report, it actually recommended that governments should integrate the climate risk management into a variety of ministers, but they should also have a dedicated central agency. So that's a bit of one of those two models there anyway. And it raises the question then of what's the relative roles of these different ways of doing it. So I want to say a little bit about all of those, but don't worry, it's not going to go too long. Thinking about then the characteristics of the challenges, there's a variety of different characterizations of things from sort of coping through to transformative, or this is Mark Howden's one here, in an agricultural context, going from incremental changes through to systemic ones where it's a whole lot of incremental ones all put together simultaneously and your whole enterprise or business is changing, through to actual transformative ones. I think the sorts of things that Karen was talking about on yesterday morning, of course, those adaptation challenges that she was talking about are up at this level of some potentially very substantial challenges as well. And you can clearly think about things which are further out into the future, this diagram I put up last night, as being ones which for most ways that organisations operate, the further you get off into the future, the harder it's likely to be to include. But that starts to raise the thought that some organisations are much more used to doing that. If you're used to building bridges with long lifetimes, then you're probably going to be better at dealing with long-term planning than an organisation which normally only has to deal in very short times. And so we can think about the characteristics of these organisations, the responders, and we already have a reasonable bit of evidence. I don't know whether you have here too, that there's much more adaptation planning going on in organisations that have as their normal business as usual longer-term planning horizons for other issues than climate change. And you can think of other sorts of business as usual operations here. And then, of course, the operating environment. So what sort of context do you have around you in terms of policies? Are your peers acting already? Are you sitting in a suite of contested values with Lord Monckton coming and talking to you every week or not? So we went out, and I won't claim this was an enormous study, but we went out and talked to 15 or 16 organisations in depth with a semi-structured set of interviews, quite long ones, against a variety of hypotheses in a number of different types of organisations, so local government, some state and national governments there, and a variety of utilities. And obviously you could do this in lots of other places. And I just want to give you a bit of a summary of some of the sort of findings that came out. I mean, firstly, not surprisingly, the operating environment did turn out to be important, and almost, I think in all cases we talked to people about the policy environment, of course, was important. That's not surprising. In almost all cases, there was some sort of trigger event externally that had triggered. I should have said that we interviewed organisations that said they were doing adaptation. So these were ones that at least felt they were achieving things in adaptation. And in almost all cases, in fact, in all cases, they had some sort of a trigger event externally that contributed to them starting to do something. The majority of them were worried about supply chains, although the interpretation of that was very different between the businesses, where things like the water utilities were talking about the electrical supplies. But in fact, in things like local government, they were talking about the supply chain of external capability in the state governments not being able to understand their problems or provide the right data, or perhaps having consultants around with the right understanding. An interesting thing that came up quite frequently, which was an important thing for our federal government member on the study, was that seed funding, often, in fact, almost always provided by his department, had been absolutely critical in almost all of these cases, again, for triggering, getting over the first threshold of doing something about this. Organisational structure. Almost all of these people talked about needing some sort of specialist function. I think I mentioned yesterday that there was a distinct split between when you talk to people, the people who had come from a specialist function that was located really with a significant executive mandate tended to be talking about action happening because of the structure. Those who didn't have that tended to be talking a lot more about the networking they had to do and the fact that they knew people in other parts of the organisation, and you got this clear sense that the action was happening despite the structure rather than because of it. There was a key role for motivated individuals, so the issue of leadership just comes through, and I mean that's right through the organisational change literature. And then I want to come onto this point in just a moment. In fact, I'll leave it till the next slide, but there's a real difference between getting mainstreaming at a strategy level and getting it in action. The third area we were looking at were what are these barriers to activation that sort of got in there. I've already mentioned the idea of trigger events, and in fact the seed funding was probably part of this. But it was quite clear that things happen much more easily when they could be easily embedded in existing business as usual practices. So to take a specific example for a moment, let's have a look at local government. So we had quite a few of these, and this is a sort of bit of an amalgam of impressions from them all. Firstly, there were clearly these two different levels of implementation, and we tend to smear these together a bit. There was the strategic decision level of getting, in this case, our councils to endorse, to embrace a strategy which included climate change as a key risk, with genuine sign-off at the political level in order to do that. But then there was you could have that and have no implementation at all, and this is really important. And I think a lot of the literature talks about plenty of adaptation planning going on, which is really in this sort of level, but not very much implementation. And we were trying to get at the actual implementation. When we did that in local government in Australia, I don't know whether this is going to exactly translate to here, but in local government in Australia, you can broadly see four types of functions that sort of run into climate change. There's the planning and development approvals, which is really about where buildings happen and what sort of standards. Then there's the actual physical engineering and the repairs and maintenance and new infrastructure sort of side of things. It's very much an engineering sort of style of things. There's a sort of social services and health. Sometimes these last two are in the same part of the organisation if it's small, but there's a social services and health thing which traditionally has done things like Meals on Wheels, but increasingly is thinking about heat waves and things now. And then there's the environmental services area. And if the specialised, if the climate change, climate adaptation unit is anywhere that's not in a executive level, then this is where it usually is. And it's very interesting, these ticks down here say how much people reported how easy it was to get things mainstreamed in terms of action as opposed to planning. That in the planning area, there was basically all you've got to do is stick another clause in for a trigger that triggers a development approval assessment or whatever. It's absolutely business as usual, just needs a new trigger. So there's a big issue about whether you've got the political commitment to put it in there, but once it's done, it's absolutely business as usual. Largely the same with engineering, that if you just tell an engineer that you've got to build to a new standard, poof, they go off and do it, it's fine. So by and large, if you come along and tell them halfway through a project to do that, then they get really annoyed with you. But really, again, it's pretty much business as usual. Perversely, it's in these areas where you might think people would think about all these social and environmental issues much more, where it was often much harder for people to get things mainstream. So I won't say much more about that, but we can pick it up if you want. I did just want, this is a tiny sidetrack, but I did just want to say that even once you've got an idea of all the planning and things that are in here, actually listing out the options that you have is quite a challenge. And this is an interesting study, which I won't talk through, but if you're interested, don't try and write down the web page, but just Google the title. But it's a serious documentation of literally about 80 or 90 options that coastal councils systematically could use for these different things down the bottom here, which was done a couple of years ago. Anyway, so where does this take us? Just my last couple of slides, really. I think I think the lessons out of all of that was that mainstreaming works really well when it can be embedded reasonably straightforwardly in business as usual sorts of things. I've given an example or two of those. But the sorts of quotes we got was that it was failing where you had to think beyond a 3-year planning horizon or where you had to have some new tool or whatever. And in fact, it was an interesting observation we had that when people did start to talk about getting adaptation into these areas, they were actively describing how they had morphed the adaptation actions to sound like business as usual, so that even if the distance from business as usual was perhaps quite large, they were trying to create a perception that the distance was much closer. And I actually heard a couple of people doing that yesterday, interestingly, specifically talking about some of the things they were doing. So we end up with a bit of a sort of mental framework, a bit like this, that there's a sort of balance, between the sort of internal operations and the external environment and the challenge that it's facing in terms of climate change. Where you go from things up the left-hand side there, where decisions tend to be more incremental and more within business as usual, but some organisations have got longer planning horizons, and there's a sort of better external environment, whatever that means. And in those ones, we should mainstream those as quickly as we can, because those are ones where it's likely to be very successful. Up the right-hand end, we've got things where the decisions are much more challenging to business as usual and more transformative. Perhaps the external environment's not so good either. And these are likely to require a maintained focus within an organisation for a while, because if you don't do that, it just won't happen. People will say they've mainstreamed it, but it actually won't be happening. And it raises the interesting question that maybe there are some things which are continually ongoing transformative, which you have to think about having some sort of persistent entity to worry about inside organisations. So this, I think, actually is my last slide. So I think we have this real rubric that mainstreaming is the essential goal, and I think it probably is true in the long run, but it really may not be desirable to do it too soon, and a much more useful and thoughtful bit of rhetoric here would talk about when should you mainstream rather than just mainstream as quickly as you can, or when should you mainstream what, perhaps. And by the way, I think thinking about a 4-degree world as opposed to a 2-degree world, which makes this whole adaptation challenge much more transformational, means you're probably pushing more things into the area where it's not desirable to mainstream them too quickly. And I tried to articulate there the circumstances in which premature mainstreaming is likely to fail. It's these are all relative. It's longer term, more value laden, more transformational decisions by entities with shorter habitual planning horizons, often exacerbated by their operating environment. So we should be really looking at those things, whether I've expressed them exactly right. And lastly, just this sense, which I would be a little less confident in saying definitely, but I think those harder ones do need to maintain, do need to remain the role of a specialised function within whatever the entity is, and preferably in this sort of model, something with a really clear executive leadership mandate, because otherwise it tends to slip away and it's really challenging. Then you might actually have the organisation doing it because of the structure rather than despite of it. And that entity can probably do some other important things, like maintaining an ongoing monitoring of horizon scanning for new things coming out. Thank you.